With the new edition of the Horus Heresy comes the first official renditions of the Saturnine Terminators since the Rogue Trader era. And to mark this occasion, Games Workshop have tasked me with painting up the new Saturnine Praetor in the colours of the Death Guard. But I couldn't just paint the model. I of course had to do a little conversion work too. So join me as I tackle some of the first Nurgle Touch Death Guard seen during the Siege of Terra. Naturally, I began with the Saturnine Praetor sprue, and kicked off my kitbashing by clipping away and cleaning up all the parts required to assemble the legs and torso. Which brought me to my first modification, armor damage. Using the fully corrupted 40k Death Guard as a guide, I began the process of adding damage across the Saturnine armor. Using my knife, I cut out small chunks along the edges of the armor sections, as well as longer, thinner scratches. This kind of battle damage is great for giving the armour a more worn look, and wouldn't look out of place on other Chaos Corrupted Legions too. My second phase of battle damage though was a little more Death Guard specific. To recreate the effect of the armour being corroded by the touch of Nurgle, I used a pin vise to drill shallow holes into the surfaces. I clumped several of these together and varied my drill bit size and depth of divot to add some variation. As this battle damage built up, it began to emulate that Death Guard look without going fully fledged Plague Marine. After all, this Praetor hasn't yet had 10,000 years of the Grandfather's blessings. This process of adding damage would be repeated across the entirety of the armour as I progressed through the build. But before I could add those scratches and divots to the torso, I first wanted to remove the embossed scrollwork from the chestplate. I didn't think that this particular detail fit the Death Guard aesthetic all that well, even before their Chaos Corruption, so I used my knife again to carefully shave away chunks of the detailing before then smoothing the surface flat. My second modification to the original model was to add just a hint of those physical mutations creeping through, but first I had to make space for them. I did this by using my drill bit to add a series of larger holes into the midsection. My goal with this was to give the appearance of armour being rotted through, so the hole needed to be irregularly shaped. I assisted in this irregularity by adding a few more shallow and smaller divots around the hole. My mutations were sourced from the Beast of Nurgle kit, where I grabbed a couple of tentacles. These were compared against the stomach hole, and clipped down and trimmed until I was able to place and glue these into the hole. I made sure not to have these tentacles reaching out too far though, as I didn't want them to interfere with the placement of the arms. Speaking of the arms, once I had finished adding the tentacles, I assembled the legs and torso together before prepping the arms with the usual battle damage. I didn't, however, glue the arms together just yet, because I first wanted to focus on the weapon. Now, the Saturnine Praetor kit comes with two options, a hammer and an axe, with me settling on the latter. I was tempted to use a scythe instead, but after comparing a few of the Deathshroud Terminators and even the Typhus kit, they all seemed a little too small. Fortunately, the axe is quite a common weapon across the Death Guard range, so it made sense to use this as well. But before I glued it to the arms, I used those same battle damage steps to heavily corrode the blade of the axe in general. Again, using the 40k and AOS Nurgle units for inspiration here was extremely helpful, and allowed me to create something that wouldn't be amiss in either one of those armies. After prepping both the axe's blade and handle, it was then glued to the arm. But before I fully assembled the model, I first had to figure out the pose. If you follow the instructions, your Praetor will have his right foot on the tactical rock and the axe held horizontally. I, of course, wanted to mix things up a bit, so reversed the feet by removing the small tab from under the foot. I also planned on having the axe being held vertically, but even with the extra elevation afforded by the rock, the axe was still too long to fit. I was able to resolve this quite easily though, by just clipping away the tip of the spike. When the model was complete, it would simply look as though it was buried into the ground. With everything prepped, I assembled the arms, torso and legs, but kept them separate from the base for the time being. My next modification was a fairly straightforward head swap. The stock heads looked pretty great, but I instead chose to swap these out with a Lord of Contagion head. The huge face blade is pretty imposing, and after a little adjustment, the head fits quite nicely into the torso. From here, I worked on the iconic Saturnine shoulder pads. I added the usual battle damage, but after assembly I opted to keep these separate to make painting them much easier. I did, however, use them to ensure that this Plague Marine tilt shield could be attached to the chest without getting in the way. With the bulk of the model complete, my focus was on adding some extra details. The Tarugis were first attached to the waist, with me adding small adjustments to the fit as required by the presence of the tentacles. To the back, I attached one of the Death Guard incense burners after clipping it away from a spare Noxious Blightbringer. Finally, a small bell on a chain was removed from the Putrid Blight King's musician and, after a little tweaking, was glued to the underside of the left pauldron. And with that, all I needed to do was to superglue the Praetor to a smaller, temporary base and drill some 1mm holes into the separate shoulder pads and wrist weapon. Into these holes, some 1mm steel wire was glued to create the holders. Keeping these parts separate from each other will just make painting them much easier. Speaking of painting, I began this process with my primers, and to shave off a little time, I decided to use some coloured spray primers from the Colour Forge. For the main torso, I used some of my very own Dead Animal Bits spray paint, which is perfect for that bone-coloured armour of the Heresy era Death Guard. The shoulders were coated with Death Rattle Green, and I primed the base and blaster with some Raven Black. This left me with the perfect starting colours and surface in which to paint on. But before we go any further with the painting, let's hear from the sponsors of this video. Me, or more specifically, my Dead Animal Bits kit. More regular viewers will already be aware that this is my very own kit, which is packed full of over 300 hard plastic bits, ready to adorn your miniatures, bases, and scenery. Inside you'll find all manner of expired creature parts, including shark jaws, bull horns, rib cages, femurs, impaled hands, severed heads, ram's horns, antlers, feathers, teeth, and more. So whether you're looking to add some grotesque mutations, grisly trophies, or just some battlefield debris to your miniatures, then this kit has something in it for you. Oh, and don't worry, it's not resin, sourcast, or even 3D printed. Everything is made from that same hard plastic Games Workshop miniatures are made from, making it the perfect kit for clipping, trimming, and adjusting into whatever shape you need it to be. So if you're planning that next kit bash, or you just need some bones to add to your bases, Dead Animal Bits has you covered. You can pick these up on my very own web store, thesparepartsemporium.com, where I have 4 boxes for those bigger projects, and even individual sprues if you just want to see what the kit has to offer. I even sell the Dead Animal Bits spray primer that I used on this Death Guard Praetor. I also package and ship everything from that web store myself, so anything you buy there goes directly to supporting this channel and the production of future kits. You can find those links down in the description, but for now, let's get back to that Death Guard Praetor. In order to bring out a few of the details in the armour, whilst also adding some shading, I decided to employ some dry brushing. I began this process by applying a thin line of Ivory Tusk from the Too Thin's coats range onto my texture palette. I then took my dry brush, dampened it ever so slightly, and carefully dipped it into the paint. The paint was then worked through the bristles by using a circular motion on my palette, adding more paint when necessary. Once the bristles had been evenly coated, I used a series of light strokes across the Dead Animal Bits base coat. As the paint left the brush gradually, it helped to form smooth gradients between the primer and the lighter Ivory Tusk, as well as settling more onto the raised edges and details. The dry brushing was continued onto the green of the shoulder pads by using some green Beret. This time, I focused the application to the upper parts of each panel, leaving the lower areas darker. This, along with the later washes and highlights, would help to create a more natural lighting effect. The final dry brushing step saw me tackle the base, first with some Dungeon Stone Grey, and then again with a lighter grey created by mixing some Ivory Tusk into my Dungeon Stone Grey. This lighter mix was focused onto just the hard edges this time around, in order to more strongly emphasize them. With the dry brushing complete, I next began the straightforward base coats. The first of these base coats saw me applying some Gung-Ho Green to the belt and tilt shield. As with all of my base coats, I added a little water to my paint to thin it out before applying 2 layers. This resulted in a good starting colour that I could build upon later. Next, I used some Amphora Red to paint the leather details of the model, including the Tarugis and wrappings of the axe. The base coats continued with me applying some Barbarian Brawn to the tentacles, Death Reaper to the various pipes, cables and undersuit, the metallics were approached in much the same way, but I did take a little more care to not overspill onto the other areas. I began with Steampunk Copper, which was applied across the various pieces of trim and decoration across the model, before I finished off with some Surcoat Silver that was painted across all of the steel details, and Carcharodon Grey to the various skull details scattered across the model. With all the base coats in place, I could now start working on the weathering, which, for the Death Guard, is an awful lot. But first, I wanted to seal in all of those base coats with a coat of satin varnish, which sits nicely between the gloss and matte varnishes. To assist me with the weathering, I decided to switch to the Pro Acryl range of paints and break out the Newsh. This is an acrylic medium that effectively slows down the drying time and allows the paint to be easily removed or adjusted. Essentially, it gives you the benefits of oil washes without having to deal with oil paints and thinners. The first paint that I mixed into this was some dark umber, also from Pro Acryl. Newsh works particularly well with stronger pigmented paints, which the PA range is. After mixing the paint into the Newsh, I then applied a thick layer of the mixture across the armour. Then, using a dampened glasses cloth, I wiped away the excess. This caused the paint to remain in the recesses, creating the appearance of grease, grime, and other bodily fluids gathering there. This also darkened down the recesses somewhat, helping to improve the overall level of detail as the raised edges contrasted against them. I also tackled each area in isolation. The Newsh has quite a long work time, but it's easier to focus on one part of the model at a time. Next, I added some coal black to the Newsh and used this a little more directly by painting it into the recesses rather than across entire surfaces. This just allowed me to focus on darkening down and emphasizing certain details, such as the vents, scratches, and deeper corrosion. To create the appearance of rust, I used some burnt orange and applied this across the steel details. Like with the previous steps, this allowed the orange to form primarily into the recesses. I even used Newsh across the tentacles by using some dark purple to darken down the parts closest to the armor. My final bit of weathering saw me use some Jade to create a verdigris effect around the bronze areas of the model. Again, this was focused more directly into the recesses and divots. From here, I returned to the Toothing Coats range and began my highlights. The first of these was to use more Ivory Tusk, but instead of a dry brush this time, I applied the paint across the edges of the armor, gouges and divots. I also applied some small, thin surface scratches, just to build upon that worn armor effect. The highlights continued much the same way, with me next tackling the green shoulder pads with some green Beret, before highlighting the Amphora Red areas with some sword hilt Burgundy. Next, I hit the black details with some Wizard Grey, the tentacles with Dwarven Skin, and the small skull details with Trooper White. For the metallics, I opted to use some Heirloom Gold across the armor trim that I base coated with some Steampunk Copper, and simply use some more Surcoat Silver over the steel areas. At this stage, everything was painted, which meant I could begin the assembly. After removing the parts from their temporary bases and wire holders, the contact points were shaved and cleaned, and everything was finally glued together. Now, this next step was an optional one. If, like me, you wanted to recreate that plasma glow across your wrist gun, then you can break out the Newsh again. Simply create a white star mix, apply it to the vents, and wipe away the excess so only the recesses remained white. Then, allow the paint to dry before repeating the step, but with a little more Jade. This time around, I focused this onto only the outer edges, creating a white to blue gradient and a really simple plasma glow effect. With the model itself complete, I next turned my attention to the base. The concrete outcrop had already been covered by earlier steps, but the area surrounding it needed filling in, and I decided to do this with some of AK Interactive's concrete texture paste. I painted this onto those surrounding areas quite thickly, helping to create an uneven, rubble-like texture. After allowing the texture paste to fully dry, I could once again do some more Newsh weathering. For my first pass, I used some dark warm grey to help darken down the concrete colour. The lighter tone was still visible in the raised texture, but this step resulted in a much darker overall grey. Then, to add a little more dirt and grime, more dark umber was painted into those recesses. And with that, all I needed to do now was to clean up the base with a flat black acrylic marker and give everything a coat of matte varnish, which left me with this. So here we have my completed Saturnine Praetor, plucked from the ranks of the Death Guard during the Siege of Terra. Now in terms of the conversion work, I wanted to keep things fairly subdued on the Nurgle front. While there were what could be described as proto-plague marines during the final days of the Heresy, they hadn't yet had the millennia of maladies and mutations to contend with. Instead, I aimed for something between their earlier Heresy and 41st Millennium appearances, which I think I achieved. The paint scheme I've employed for this miniature would be perfectly usable for those early Heresy Death Guard forces too. Just tone back the weathering until you're happy with the result. As always, I'll include a list of all the paints and parts used in this video down in the description below, along where you can pick them up. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in picking up a box for yourself and you're in the UK or the US, then check out my website, www.sparepartsemporium.com. If you're in the EU or other parts of the world, then you can find them on the Wargames Atlantic web store as well. But before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Banyevrian, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, George Kanzini Roberts, Immaterial Creations, Cornbread, Little Templar, Maciej Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Olden Time, Sam Sepulveda, Swedsman, and Tim. And my top channel members who are Alex Verne, Bon Johnson, Daniel Reese, Dave, Doug H, Dwarf of War, Guy Bazant, John Gibbs, Mark Taylor, Miso Pogon, Nunnington Paints, Philip Poya, Ryan O'Shaughnessy, S.O., Satoran, S.J. Carper, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.